The sun beat down relentlessly as Marcus slowly pulled his black BMW into the car wash. It was one of those rare moments when he allowed himself to indulge in a little luxury, treating his car to a pristine wash after a grueling week of back-to-back meetings. As he stepped out of the vehicle, he adjusted his crisp suit and slicked back hair, giving the car a final glance before heading to the small kiosk to pay. His mind was elsewhere, pondering the week's challenges, the responsibilities of managing his successful company, and the long road he had traveled from humble beginnings. But as he walked past the rows of shiny cars, something in the air felt different today. At the counter stood the owner of the car wash, a middle-aged man with a thick mustache and an air of arrogance that was impossible to miss. His eyes scanned Marcus, and though it was only for a moment, Marcus could feel the judgment lurking behind them. The owner, a man who clearly prided himself on his small business, had no idea who Marcus was. To him, Marcus was just another well-dressed man in a luxury car, a stereotype the owner had long held in his mind. As Marcus approached the counter, the owner barely looked up from his work. But when he finally did, he gave a smirk that immediately put Marcus on edge. "You sure this car needs a wash?" the owner said with a chuckle, eyeing Marcus's sleek car with an exaggerated look of disdain. "I mean, with a ride like that, it's pretty much spotless, isn't it? Maybe I should charge you extra for all the time it'll take to clean it." His tone was sharp, laced with a mockery that Marcus immediately recognized. Marcus paused for a brief moment, his instincts telling him to ignore it, to brush it off and keep going. But something inside him snapped. The owner's words were dripping with more than just casual arrogance. They were tainted with a long-standing, ingrained prejudice that Marcus knew all too well. It was as if the man assumed that, because of the color of his skin and the car he drove, Marcus was someone to be belittled, someone who didn't deserve the respect that others with wealth and status might automatically receive. "I'm sure it does, but I'm here to have it cleaned," Marcus replied calmly, his voice betraying nothing of the turmoil boiling inside him. He was used to this, used to people making assumptions, drawing conclusions based on nothing but appearances and preconceived notions. But today, the insult hit differently. The owner's eyes narrowed, and he leaned over the counter, a smirk still plastered across his face. "Yeah, sure, I'll just get my guys on it," he muttered, clearly not bothering to hide his disdain. "I guess you've got the money to spare, huh? A car like this, you probably don't even care about the price." Marcus's chest tightened, his heart rate quickening. It wasn't just the insults, it was the fact that, in this moment, it wasn't just a car wash. This was about so much more than that. It was about a man who had worked tirelessly, day in and day out, to build something for himself, only to have it all reduced to something superficial. He stared at the car wash owner for a moment, weighing his options. The world was full of people like this, people who saw him not as a person, but as a walking stereotype, someone to be dismissed. Maybe he should just let it go, just pay and leave. But as he glanced around, he saw the faces of the other customers in line, their eyes shifting uncomfortably between the two men. The air was thick with tension, as if everyone was waiting for something to happen. With a calmness that surprised even himself, Marcus took a slow breath and replied, "I've worked my entire life for everything I have. You don't know me, and you sure as hell don't know my story." His voice was steady, but there was an undercurrent of something sharp and unwavering that made the car wash owner falter for a split second. But the man quickly recovered, scoffing. Yeah, I'm sure you worked hard, just like all those guys who think they can buy their way into anything." He waved his hand dismissively, and Marcus could see the contempt in his eyes. The owner turned to the workers in the back, barking orders, clearly not wanting to engage any further with the conversation. Marcus's anger flared, but he didn't allow himself to react. He wasn't going to let this man get under his skin. He was used to people like him, people who thought they knew who he was, what he was about. But they didn't know anything. They didn't know the long hours he had spent fighting against the system, working double shifts, studying late into the night. They didn't know about the sacrifices he'd made, the sleepless nights when he'd wondered if it was all worth it. They didn't know the pain of watching his mother struggle, of fighting tooth and nail to make sure that he never had to experience that same kind of hardship. The owner turned his back, clearly expecting Marcus to either back off or leave in frustration. But Marcus stood his ground, eyes fixed on the back of the man's head. A wave of calm washed over him. He wasn't going to let this be just another chapter in a story of silent suffering. Today, something was going to change. He wasn't going to walk away as the defeated party. Not this time. As he stood there, the harsh words still hanging in the air, Marcus felt something shift. It was subtle at first, like the tension in the room had doubled, or perhaps the weight of the injustice had grown heavier. The other customers were silent now, watching him, waiting to see what he would do. Marcus's mind raced. He could feel the pressure mounting, the eyes of others bearing down on him. But instead of walking away, he simply waited. He wasn't going to give this man the satisfaction of watching him react. There was a brief moment where the whole world seemed to pause. The hum of the car wash machines in the background, the muffled conversations of other customers, even the steady beat of Marcus's heart, they all faded into the background. It was just him and this man, standing on opposite sides of an invisible line that neither of them had created but both had crossed. Finally, after a long pause, Marcus broke the silence. "I'm not going anywhere," he said quietly, but with a firmness that could not be ignored. "But you're going to learn something today, something you'll never forget." The car wash owner turned back around at the sound of Marcus's voice, his eyebrows furrowing in confusion, as if he couldn't quite comprehend what was happening. For a brief moment, the arrogance in his posture wavered, replaced by something that resembled uncertainty. He glanced at Marcus, then at the workers behind him, unsure of how to respond. The other customers in line had gone eerily quiet, all eyes shifting between the two men, as if holding their collective breath, waiting for some sort of escalation. Marcus could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him, but he wasn't about to let it slip away. He knew exactly what was at stake here. This wasn't just about a car wash or a snide comment. It was about dignity, respect, and making a stand in a world that often overlooked people like him. As the owner shuffled uncomfortably, Marcus's gaze remained unflinching. "You know," Marcus began, his voice still steady, yet charged with an energy that only came from years of pent-up frustration. "I've learned in life that the way people see you often has more to do with them than it does with you. This car, this suit, these things don't define me. They never have." He took a step forward, his feet now planted firmly on the ground. "But you," he gestured toward the owner, "you've defined me. You've decided who I am based on nothing more than what you see on the surface." The car wash owner opened his mouth to retort, but Marcus didn't let him. "You think I don't know how people like you look at me? You assume that because I've managed to get ahead, that I'm some sort of fraud. But I've worked for everything I've got, and that's something you can't take away with your words." The owner's face twisted in a sneer, but there was a flicker of hesitation behind his eyes. Marcus's words had struck a nerve, but the man wasn't ready to back down. He shifted his weight, standing taller as if to assert his dominance once again. "I didn't ask for your life story," the owner snapped. "Just get your car washed or leave." But Marcus wasn't backing down. This wasn't just about getting his car washed. It was about showing the man, and everyone else standing by, that he wouldn't tolerate being belittled because of the color of his skin or because of the wealth he had worked so hard to earn. "You don't get it, do you?" Marcus continued. "You don't get that your words can't break me. They don't make me feel less than. They only expose who you are. They show the kind of person you are, hiding behind your little business, thinking you can get away with treating people however you want." The silence was deafening now, the weight of the moment thick in the air. No one spoke. It felt as if the world had stopped turning, leaving only the two men locked in this silent battle. For the first time, Marcus noticed how many eyes were on him. The other customers were no longer just passive observers. Some looked uncomfortable, others were clearly intrigued, and a few even seemed ready to speak up. But no one did. Marcus took a step back, his gaze never leaving the owner. You can keep treating people like this, but sooner or later, you're going to find yourself alone. You're going to realize that people who think they can step on others never get to the top without something to hold them up. And when that something is gone, you'll be left with nothing but the very contempt you've shown me. The car wash owner's face reddened with rage, but he seemed at a loss for words. Instead of shouting back, his lips pressed tightly together, and his hands clenched at his sides. It was almost as if he didn't know how to react to someone who wasn't afraid of him. Someone who wasn't intimidated by his condescension. Marcus knew this was the moment. This was the tipping point. Just as the tension seemed about to boil over, a figure emerged from the back of the car wash, a woman dressed in a business suit with a confidence that immediately commanded attention. She moved with purpose, her heels clicking sharply against the pavement as she approached the counter. The car wash owner, still visibly flustered by Marcus's words, didn't notice her until she was right next to him. Without so much as a glance at Marcus, the woman spoke directly to the car wash owner. "I believe you've forgotten who you're speaking to," she said, her voice sharp and unwavering. The man turned to face her, his eyes widening in recognition. The woman, who appeared to be in her mid-30s, was not someone who would typically visit a car wash on a casual day. There was an aura of power around her, the kind that only came from years of climbing the corporate ladder. She was the kind of person Marcus knew, someone who didn't just command respect but earned it. And what happened next would be the turning point neither the car wash owner nor Marcus had seen coming. "I'm sorry, what's going on here?" the woman asked, her gaze moving from the flustered owner to the still-standing Marcus. The owner, suddenly looking small and defeated, stammered in response. I was just..." The woman cut him off. "You were just treating a paying customer like trash. Is that what you were doing?" Her words were sharp, precise, like a blade cutting through the man's excuses. "Do you know who this is?" She gestured to Marcus, her eyes locked with the car wash owner's in a way that made him feel smaller by the second. The man swallowed hard, clearly unsure of how to respond. But Marcus knew who this woman was. She was Lisa, a former business associate from a deal he had worked on several years ago. Back then, she was the one who had negotiated the terms with his company, a rising star in the corporate world who had quickly made a name for herself. She had no reason to be here, but her appearance in this moment felt like fate. "I think we need to have a serious talk," Lisa said, her voice unyielding as she turned her gaze back to Marcus, then back to the owner. "I'll make sure your little outburst here is handled properly." Her eyes were now filled with a cold, calculating fire that seemed to burn through the car wash owner's defenses. For the first time that day, the car wash owner looked completely and utterly afraid. He opened his mouth, but nothing came out. Marcus could barely suppress a smile. This was the moment. The moment when his calm, calculated response had not only kept his dignity intact, but had also brought a sense of justice into play. The car wash owner had made the mistake of underestimating the wrong person, and now Marcus had the upper hand. But this wasn't about victory for Marcus. It was about the power of standing up. It was about showing that no matter how small the encounter seemed, it could still make a difference. And in that moment, Marcus knew this was just the beginning of something far greater than a simple car wash. The car wash owner stood frozen, his mouth slightly agape, clearly rattled by the appearance of Lisa and her stern words. He had never expected someone like her to show up, especially not in the middle of this small, insignificant altercation. But as the silence stretched on, Marcus could feel a surge of something much more powerful than anger: vindication. He'd kept his composure, just as he always had. It wasn't about the car or the treatment. It was about the principle of the matter. And now, in the wake of that principle, everything was beginning to shift. Lisa turned to Marcus, her expression softening as she nodded subtly, acknowledging the quiet strength he had shown in the face of hostility. "Don't worry," she said quietly enough for only him to hear. "This will be taken care of." Her words were not just a promise. They were a declaration of intent, the kind that made Marcus feel as though everything in the universe had aligned to right this wrong. The car wash owner stammered once more, his bravado quickly dissolving under Lisa's steady gaze. I didn't mean anything by it," he mumbled, the arrogance that had marked his earlier attitude now completely stripped away. "I was just joking, all right. Just a little humor, you know." His voice cracked as he tried to explain, but it was clear that his earlier venom had dissipated. The weight of the situation, his actions now under scrutiny, had finally broken his facade. Lisa didn't even spare him a glance. She pulled out her phone, swiping through it with methodical precision, as though this was a routine she'd performed many times before. Marcus watched in silence, a quiet tension still hanging in the air. He could feel the other customers behind him, their curiosity palpable as they all waited for something to happen. Lisa's fingers moved quickly, her eyes flicking from the phone to the car wash owner, then back to Marcus. "I'm going to handle this the right way," she said with finality. "Your actions today were completely unacceptable. I know the local Chamber of Commerce, and I'm making a call to the Business Association right now. This isn't the kind of behavior that's tolerated. It's time for a real conversation about respect." The car wash owner's face turned a shade paler with every word Lisa spoke. She wasn't bluffing. Marcus could tell she had the power to back up every word she said. The man was a small business owner, but even he understood the weight that Lisa carried. She wasn't just a businesswoman. She was a force to be reckoned with. As Lisa ended the call and slipped her phone back into her bag, she looked at Marcus, her eyes filled with an understanding that went deeper than just this one interaction. "You've shown real strength today," she said, her voice softer now. "That's not easy, especially in the face of ignorance." Marcus could feel a deep sense of appreciation for Lisa's intervention. She hadn't just been a bystander. She had stepped in when it mattered most, offering not just a lifeline to Marcus, but a way to hold the car wash owner accountable. In that brief moment, Lisa had not only saved the day, but she had helped show that no act of disrespect, no matter how small, should ever go unchallenged. The car wash owner was now visibly sweating, his shoulders sagging as he realized the gravity of what he had done. He had underestimated Marcus and allowed his biases to lead him astray. It wasn't just about a customer and a car wash. It was about everything. The systemic issues of racism, the prejudices that were far too deeply ingrained in society, the quiet, daily indignities that people like Marcus faced in silence. Lisa turned to him one last time, her voice cutting through the tension like a knife. "I expect an apology. Not just to Marcus here, but to anyone else you've ever disrespected in this manner. Because this isn't acceptable." Her words echoed in the stillness, and for a moment, the car wash owner seemed to shrink under the weight of them. His apology, when it finally came, was as reluctant as it was insincere. "I'm sorry," he muttered, barely meeting Marcus's gaze. "I didn't mean to offend you." Marcus didn't respond immediately. He could feel his pulse quickening, but he was done. He wasn't here for apologies that were forced out under duress. He wasn't here to fight for the satisfaction of seeing someone brought low. What he was looking for, what he had always longed for, was respect. And in that moment, he realized he didn't need the car wash owner's apology. It was hollow, a meaningless gesture that didn't even begin to repair the damage done. He nodded once, his expression calm, but his words firm. "Your apology is noted," he said. "But I don't need it. I need you to remember this day. I need you to remember that there's more to people than what you see on the surface. And next time, maybe think before you speak." As he turned to leave, Marcus felt an unexpected sense of relief. It wasn't just about him winning this moment. It was about the ripple effect it would create. The way this small act of standing up for himself would resonate with others. The way maybe, just maybe, It would spark a shift in how people treated each other in places like this, places where biases and prejudices often ran unchecked. Lisa followed him to the door, offering a final nod of encouragement as they stepped out into the bright afternoon. The sun shone down warmly on the pavement, casting a long shadow as they walked side by side. "You know," Lisa said after a beat, her voice tinged with a hint of amusement, "I didn't expect to be stepping in at a car wash today, but I'm glad I was here." Marcus smiled, a small, knowing smile that reflected his quiet satisfaction. Sometimes, it's the smallest moments that remind you how far we've come, and how far we still have to go. They shared a look, and in that moment, Marcus knew something had changed, not just for him, but for everyone who had witnessed what happened today. The car wash owner would go on with his business, but he would never forget the lesson Marcus had taught him. And Marcus, for his part, would keep moving forward, stronger and more resolved than ever. The road ahead was long, but with each challenge, he was becoming more certain of the path he was meant to walk. The fight for respect and dignity wasn't just his battle, it was everyone's, and he would continue to fight, no matter how small the victory, because he knew that every step was a victory. As Marcus and Lisa walked away from the car wash, the weight of the day's events seemed to follow them, lingering in the air between them like a thick fog. It was an unspoken understanding that settled between them, something deeper than words. The encounter had stirred something in both of them, a quiet sense of satisfaction, but also a gnawing realization that this wasn't the end. It couldn't be. There were too many other people out there like the car wash owner, too many moments of everyday prejudice and ignorance that went unchecked. Marcus ran his fingers through his hair as he took in the surroundings. The sun was starting to dip lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the street. The world around him seemed to be moving in slow motion, yet his mind raced. The encounter had reignited something inside him. It was more than just about the car wash, or the insults he'd endured. It was about something bigger, about standing up for dignity in a world that often tried to strip it away. "Thanks," Marcus said quietly, glancing over at Lisa. Her presence beside him felt steady, like an anchor. She didn't need to say anything more. She understood. "You didn't have to step in like that, but I'm grateful you did." Lisa smiled, her eyes focused ahead. "Sometimes it's easy to stand on the sidelines, but I've seen enough to know that silence just lets the wrongs continue unchecked. You did the hard part today, standing firm, showing restraint when it would have been easier to lash out. That's not something a lot of people can do." Marcus chuckled softly, though the sound was tinged with the faintest trace of disbelief. "It wasn't easy. I wanted to snap back, but I knew that wouldn't get me anywhere. It wasn't about him. He doesn't matter. It was about making sure the people around me saw something different, making sure my response wasn't just about me. It was about all of us who've had to deal with this kind of thing our whole lives." Lisa nodded thoughtfully, her pace slowing a little. "I get it. We carry the weight of those moments, whether we want to or not. And sometimes we just need to show that we won't be silent anymore, that we won't be complicit." The two walked for a few more blocks, their conversation drifting into a comfortable silence. Marcus had known Lisa for a few years, but their paths had never crossed in such a meaningful way before. There was something about this moment, though, that made it feel as if they had both crossed some invisible threshold, as if the encounter had somehow shifted their understanding of each other. As they approached a nearby cafe, Marcus stopped and turned to face her. "I don't know where to go from here," he admitted, his voice betraying a vulnerability he usually kept hidden. "I fought my whole life to get to where I am, to prove that I deserve everything I've worked for. But moments like today, they make me wonder how much farther we really have to go. How many more people are out there who think just like that car wash owner? How do we even begin to change that?" Lisa paused, her gaze thoughtful as she considered his words. "I think it starts with small moments like this. You didn't back down. You didn't let that man define you, even though he tried. That's what matters. It's the moments when people refuse to stay silent, when they stand up and say, "I won't be treated like this." Marcus looked at her, a faint spark of understanding flickering in his eyes. "Yeah, I guess I've been so focused on the big things, on making a name for myself and proving people wrong, that I've overlooked how important these smaller victories are." Lisa smiled, but there was something bittersweet in her expression. "Don't discount them. Every time someone stands up, it shifts the world just a little bit. It makes it a place where people like you, people who have fought hard for their place in this world, can stand a little taller." A moment of silence passed between them, the weight of the conversation lingering in the air. Marcus could feel the truth of her words settling deep inside him, grounding him in a way he hadn't expected. It wasn't just about personal triumphs or success. It was about pushing back against the forces that tried to silence the very people who deserved to be heard. As they stepped into the cafe, the noise of the outside world seemed to fade into the background, replaced by the soft hum of conversation and the clinking of cups and plates. It felt like a moment of peace, the world outside momentarily at rest. They ordered coffee and sat by the window, the evening light casting a warm glow over the room. The events of the afternoon were still fresh in Marcus's mind, but he felt a sense of quiet resolution that hadn't been there before. "Do you ever think about how much we've had to fight just to exist in spaces that weren't built for us?" Marcus asked, his voice more contemplative now. Lisa took a sip of her coffee, her eyes meeting his with a mixture of understanding and sadness. "All the time. But I also think about how much we've fought for, how far we've come. It's not just about surviving. It's about thriving, even in spaces that weren't meant for us. It's about showing that we belong, that we have a right to be seen and heard." Marcus nodded slowly, his mind processing her words. "Yeah, and I think that's what I've been missing. I've been so focused on surviving, on getting through the next obstacle, that I've forgotten to live in the moment, to appreciate the journey for what it is, even with all the setbacks." The conversation shifted as they discussed everything from their childhood memories to the complexities of navigating the corporate world. They spoke openly and honestly, no longer just acquaintances, but partners in a shared understanding of the challenges that came with their lives. As the evening wore on, the cafe grew quieter, and Marcus felt a deep sense of gratitude for this unexpected connection. He had started the day facing an insult, a moment that should have left him frustrated and defeated. But now, with Lisa's insight and the quiet reflection of the evening, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. When the time came to part ways, they exchanged a firm handshake, and Lisa smiled warmly at him. "You've got something special, Marcus. Never forget that." "Thanks, Lisa. I won't," he said, feeling the weight of her words as he turned to leave. The cool night air greeted him outside, but it felt lighter somehow, as though the burdens of the day had lifted. As he walked down the street, Marcus couldn't help but feel that something had shifted within him. The events of the day had opened his eyes to something deeper, the power of standing tall in the face of prejudice, the strength in quiet defiance, and the importance of recognizing the small victories in a world that often overlooked them. He knew the fight wasn't over, but for the first time in a long while, he felt ready for whatever came next. In that moment, Marcus realized that true change didn't always come from grand gestures or sweeping reforms. Sometimes, it came from the quiet strength of one person refusing to be silenced. And as he walked away, he carried that quiet strength with him, something he would never let go. As the weeks passed, Marcus found himself reflecting more and more on that afternoon. The way the car wash owner had mocked him, the way Lisa had stepped in, and how he had managed to remain calm when everything inside him had wanted to lash out. It was as if that moment had opened up a new path for him, one where the mundane struggles of life had suddenly become more significant. The weight of his experiences, all the things he had endured in silence, seemed to shift from a burden to a source of strength. But he also realized that strength wasn't just in surviving. It was in taking action, in using his voice, and in standing up for others who might not have the same ability or courage to do so. He began to see the world around him differently. Everywhere he went, he started noticing small acts of prejudice, slights and insults that, like the one he had faced at the car wash, had gone unnoticed by most. A woman in a store being ignored while the less qualified customer was attended to. A colleague at work being belittled in front of the group for voicing an opinion. These things were everywhere, but they were often dismissed as small, inconsequential moments. Yet Marcus knew now that they were anything but insignificant. Each one, no matter how small, chipped away at the dignity of the person who was subjected to it, and each one had the power to spiral into something far worse if left unchecked. But Marcus wasn't just a passive observer anymore. He had seen the impact of standing up for himself, and now he felt compelled to do the same for others. It wasn't about grand gestures or sweeping changes. It was about small, consistent acts of resistance that could start to shift the tide. So he began. In his office, he started noticing how often his employees were dismissed for being outspoken, particularly those who, like him, didn't always fit the mold of traditional corporate culture. It was subtle, but it was there. The way their opinions were brushed aside, their ideas ignored, their contributions diminished. One afternoon during a meeting with his team, Marcus saw it happening again. A young woman, Anne, who had just joined the company, raised her hand to share an idea about a new marketing approach. She was met with dismissive glances from the more senior members of the team, their eyes already drifting to their phones, their minds clearly elsewhere. He could feel Anne's frustration growing, her hesitance creeping in as she prepared to withdraw into silence. And in that moment, Marcus saw himself in her. Before anyone could brush her off completely, Marcus leaned forward, his voice firm but encouraging. "I think Anne has a point," he said, addressing the room. "In fact, let's hear her out. This could be the fresh perspective we need." The room fell silent for a moment, the sudden shift in energy palpable. Anne looked at Marcus, a mix of surprise and gratitude on her face. Her voice grew stronger as she continued, and by the end of the meeting, her idea had become the cornerstone of a new project that everyone rallied behind. As the days went on, Marcus continued to make these small, quiet changes, whether it was calling out a casual racist remark from a colleague or offering support to someone who had been left out of a conversation. He wasn't trying to be a hero. He was simply doing what he felt was right. His leadership began to shift, and with it, the atmosphere in the office. People started feeling seen. They started feeling heard. They started standing taller, their confidence growing as they realized that their voices mattered. Marcus's personal life began to shift as well. He had always kept a distance between his work and personal life, but now there was no separating the two. The principles he held at work began to seep into his daily life, into the way he interacted with friends and strangers alike. He started becoming more vocal about the issues that had long been swept under the rug, whether it was in casual conversations with old friends or in more formal settings. The more he spoke up, the more he realized how much of his silence had been ingrained into him, how much of it had been a shield to protect himself from the harsh realities of the world. One evening, he was out with a group of old friends at a bar, and the topic of racism came up. There was an air of discomfort in the conversation, as some of his friends made casual jokes about race, jokes that, until recently, Marcus would have let slide. But that night, something inside him snapped. "You don't get it," he said, his voice calm but filled with an underlying power that caught everyone off guard. "You don't get that these jokes are not just words. They're weapons. They hurt people, even if you don't mean it. And I've seen enough of it to know that this shit doesn't just go away because we ignore it. So don't pretend it's harmless, because it's not." The room grew quiet, the weight of his words sinking in. For a moment, there was nothing but silence. His friends looked at him, some surprised, others uncomfortable, but none of them dared to brush off what he had said. The conversation shifted, and for the first time in a long while, Marcus felt like he wasn't the one on the outside. He wasn't the one having to hide his true feelings, his true self. He was just being real, something he had spent most of his life being afraid to do. It wasn't easy. The world wasn't suddenly going to change overnight. The prejudices that ran deep in society didn't just vanish because one man decided to speak up. But Marcus knew that it had to start somewhere, and that somewhere was here. He had seen how one voice, one small act of defiance, could begin to make ripples. And in his heart, he knew that those ripples would eventually spread. Months later, Marcus found himself sitting in a meeting with a group of investors, discussing a new business venture. The conversation was moving smoothly when one of the investors, an older man with a long history in the industry, made a comment that caught Marcus's attention. It wasn't overtly racist, but it carried an undertone of doubt, a subtle dismissal of a new proposal from one of the younger members of the team. It was the kind of remark that many would have let slide, the kind of remark that was so deeply embedded in the system that it often went unnoticed. But Marcus wasn't going to let it slide. Not this time. Without hesitation, he interjected, his voice firm and steady. "Actually, I think that idea is worth considering. In fact, I believe it could be the key to moving forward. Let's give it a shot." The room fell silent for a moment, the shift palpable. The older man looked at Marcus, surprise flashing across his face. It wasn't the first time Marcus had pushed back, but there was something different about this moment. Something in the air had changed. The meeting continued, but the tone had shifted. The younger team members were more confident. Their ideas were being heard. The dynamic in the room had been forever altered, and it wasn't just because Marcus had spoken up. It was because he had created a space where everyone's voice mattered. And as Marcus walked out of that meeting, he couldn't help but feel a deep sense of fulfillment. It wasn't about winning battles or defeating opponents. It was about creating a world where respect was not a privilege for the few, but a right for everyone. The path wasn't easy, and it wouldn't always be clear. But with each step, with each small act of resistance, Marcus knew he was moving closer to the world he had always dreamed of. A world where everyone could stand tall and be heard. The days passed in a blur, each one carrying its own weight, its own challenges, but with a renewed sense of purpose that fueled Marcus like never before. His actions had begun to reverberate not just in his professional life, but in the way he viewed the world and his place in it. Every small decision he made, whether it was stepping up to support a colleague or taking a stand for something bigger than himself, seemed to carry more significance. There was a quiet power in those moments, a sense that he was no longer merely existing in the world, but shaping it in ways he had never thought possible. Marcus found himself increasingly drawn to the idea of mentorship. In the past, he had kept his experiences and insights to himself, thinking they were too personal, too hard-won to share. But now, something inside him urged him to reach out, to pass on the lessons he had learned to others who might be walking the same difficult path he had once walked. It wasn't enough for him to simply change the dynamics of his workplace or his circle of friends. He wanted to create lasting change, to make a real difference in the lives of people who needed it the most. He began by reaching out to the younger employees at his company. People like Anne, who had so recently been overlooked in a meeting, but who had the potential to be a leader if given the right guidance. He invited her to lunch one afternoon, just the two of them, away from the office's distractions. She was initially hesitant, unsure of what Marcus wanted, but when they sat down and started talking, she quickly realized that this wasn't a typical corporate mentorship meeting. Marcus wasn't here to talk about resumes or performance reviews. He was here to talk about life. "Anne, let me ask you something," Marcus began, his voice awful. "When you came into this company, what did you expect? What were you hoping to find?" Anne shifted uncomfortably in her seat, the question catching her off guard. She had always been the quiet one in meetings, the one who spoke up only when necessary, if at all. She had learned early on not to rock the boat, to keep her head down and do her work. But here, with Marcus, it felt different. She could feel his sincerity, his genuine interest in her as a person, not just an employee. "I guess I just wanted to prove myself," she said slowly. "I wanted to show that I belong here, that I'm just as capable as anyone else." But sometimes it feels like I'm invisible, like my ideas don't matter, or I'm just not part of the conversation." Marcus nodded, understanding all too well. He had been there once too, fighting for recognition in a world that often overlooked him because of who he was or where he came from. "You're not invisible, Anne," he said, his voice firm but kind. "The world might try to make you feel that way, but you are more than capable. Don't let anyone make you believe otherwise." As the conversation went on, Marcus shared his own journey with her, how he had struggled to break through the barriers that had been placed in front of him, how he had fought not just for success, but for the respect and dignity that he deserved. "The thing is, Anne," he continued, "people will try to define you based on their own limitations. They'll make assumptions about who you are, what you're capable of, and what you deserve. But you don't have to accept those assumptions. You get to define yourself." Anne listened intently, her eyes wide as if she were hearing these words for the first time. In that moment, she realized something that she hadn't allowed herself to consider before. She was worthy of being heard. Her voice mattered. The conversation didn't end with just advice. It became a turning point in Anne's own journey. That afternoon, she left the cafe with a new sense of clarity, a feeling of empowerment that she hadn't known she was missing. Marcus had given her more than just guidance. He had given her belief in herself. But mentorship wasn't something Marcus reserved only for those he worked with. He also began reaching out to others in his community, young people who were still navigating the complexities of growing up in a world that often judged them based on their appearance or their background. He volunteered at local youth centers, speaking to groups about resilience, about fighting back against the stereotypes that society tried to impose on them. He told them his story, the real story, the one about growing up in tough circumstances, about facing countless obstacles, and about how those struggles had shaped him into who he was today. It wasn't always easy to open up, to lay bare the raw, unvarnished truth of his past. But Marcus knew it was important. When he spoke to these kids, he saw something in their eyes that reminded him of himself at their age, a quiet longing for something more, a desire for change, but not always knowing how to get there. He shared with them the most important lesson he had ever learned. Change didn't come from waiting for the world to change. It came from within. It came from taking control of your own narrative and refusing to let the world dictate your worth. The more he mentored others, the more he realized that the work wasn't just about teaching others how to succeed. It was about showing them that they were already worthy of success. It was about helping them see the value in themselves when the world often didn't. And that, Marcus believed, was where true change started, not with grand gestures, but with small acts of defiance against the system that sought to keep people down. But even as he worked to inspire others, Marcus knew that his journey wasn't over. There were still countless others who needed the same message, people who, like him, had been made to feel invisible, overlooked, or unworthy of their success. He had learned the hard way that the fight wasn't just about overcoming external obstacles. It was about overcoming the internalized doubts and fears that had been planted in him by a world that told him he didn't belong. That was why he began to speak out more publicly, participating in panels and discussions about diversity and inclusion. He became an advocate, not just for himself, but for everyone who had ever been made to feel like they didn't belong. And though the work was difficult, often grueling, Marcus felt a sense of fulfillment he had never known before. Every time he spoke, every time he shared his story, he saw the change in others. He saw people realizing that they didn't have to stay quiet, that they didn't have to let the world dictate their worth. And yet, despite all the progress he had made, Marcus knew that this was just the beginning. The road ahead would still be fraught with challenges. Society's biases weren't going to disappear overnight, but he had found something far more valuable than success or recognition. He had found his purpose. It wasn't about being seen or heard by everyone. It was about making sure that the people who had been invisible, who had been silenced, could find their voices too. In the end, Marcus understood that true change was not about the number of victories you could claim, but about the number of lives you could touch, the number of people you could lift up and empower. And as he walked forward into his future, he knew that his work was far from done. It was just beginning.